right, we are back with another response video to CosmicSkeptic, this time of a more recent video that he made on compatibilism and free will. So we're gonna run through this thing. Matt and I are gonna run through this thing and offer some of our thoughts, give a few little critiques, do some nitpicking, and so on and so forth. Lots of nitpicking. Like, this is just a whole video of nitpicking. And we're going to talk about souls and agent causation. We're going to talk about spiders. We're going to talk about the universe. Please enjoy.
So the existence of free will is, surprise, surprise, a question that philosophers have been debating since before records began. And the main problem appears to be a contradiction between two thoughts. First, there are really good, compelling arguments in favor of all of our actions ultimately being determined. And by determined, I mean that if we were to rewind the...
What are those arguments?
It's basically, I think, a loose image of it is what Seller says. You got the manifest image of the world and the scientific image of the world. And science is telling us that on the macro level, you got billiard ball causation. I mean, it's just empirically confirmed. On the micro level, you got indeterminism, maybe, if those interpretations of the mathematical formalism of quantum mechanics goes through. And no matter where that goes, I mean, on the macro level, you do have a kind of determinism.
What about the old heads, though? What about, I think Democritus? Democritus was an old determinist.
I don't know what his arguments are, but yeah, I think his view definitely implies determinism. There's probably a bunch of different kinds of there's probably logical determinism, physical determinism. Today, maybe CosmicSkeptic would endorse something like, it's just implied by the scientific image of the world that's been revealed through the unparalleled success of the empirical methods of science in the last 4 centuries, something like that.
Yeah, I wish I knew. There must be. I know there are some philosophical arguments for determinism, but no one really talks about them. Everyone seems to sort of, at least in the literature as I'm familiar with it, the contemporary literature, I think everyone kind of just thinks that whether or not determinism obtains is a matter for physics to settle.
Yes, that's exactly what Dirk Pereboom says in his book, Living Without Free Will. He basically just says, we have the intuitions that come with our belief that we feel like we have free will. And then he basically says that. He's like, but unfortunately, the hard sciences are telling us a picture about the world according to which free will just can't find a place. And so we gotta reconcile this aporia. We have to, put these two together somehow.
To say that the hard sciences count in favor of determinism or against free will, if we're going to come to a settled position on whether or not determinism obtains, then the physical sciences are the way to go. The physical sciences are going to tell us whether or not determinism obtains, if anything is going to tell us. Okay. Well, what about theistic determinism? What are the arguments there? Why I think that theistic determinism obtains?
Well, 2 ways. One, you could probably say that there's a causal transaction between the decree of God and all our actions and everything that happens, on the basis of that decree, like a deterministic type of decree. Or you might be suckered into thinking that just because God knows what you're going to do, you're fated to do it.
It would be a kind of determinism that is localized to the created universe, but not a determinism that's localized to all causal links that exist, that obtain at all, because the causal link involved that goes from God to creation wouldn't be deterministic, presumably.
Well, the way the argument's cashed out is it's impossible for the contents of God's knowledge to be false, right?
Right.
You can't falsify God's knowledge. Mm-hmm. It's impossible for me to act in such a way as to falsify God's knowledge, is to make God's past beliefs false.
And it was true
temporal necessity there
yesterday that God knew that today at 10 o'clock you'd eat honeycombs. That's an untouchable truth. Today at 9:59, that was an untouchable truth that yesterday God believed that today you'd eat honeycombs at 10.
Because we would argue, or Molina would argue, it is touchable.
Well, I guess another argument for theistic determinism might just be, oh, well, God has to create the best possible world, and there's only one best possible world.
Right.
And God has to create it.
That's modal collapse too, probably.
It stinks of modal collapse, but
Man would still land on the moon in 1969. Barack Obama would still be elected president in 2008, and you would once again be sat watching this video whenever it is that you're currently doing so.
All of that recurring the way he just said it would recur if determinism were true could also recur the same way if determinism were false. That the playback could go the exact same way again. So that's not sufficient for a deterministic picture. I disagree.
Determinism is largely a product of the rise of the scientific method and the belief that the universe operates in accordance with laws of cause and effect, that every event in the universe has some sufficient explanation, that is, some preceding cause that necessitated it.
A preceding cause that necessitated it? See, there's different kinds of determinisms. You don't have to have like the cause necessitating the effect.
Yeah, that's like causal determinism at the links.
Well, that sounds like logical determinism. Like it'd be a contradiction. There's a necessary relationship between cause and effect. I mean, it would be one thing to say that a cause necessitates the effect. I think we went over this in the last video, and just saying that the cause is sufficient for the effect.
Yeah, wasn't Hume's view that had the constant conjunction view, right? Causation is just constant conjunction. Yeah, contiguous chains. And but then he also said elsewhere that just what it means, causation just is a necessary connection, right?
I thought it was the very next sentence in the treatise where he just says, yeah, it's the very next one. It's like two different like analyses of causation. One was the constant conjunction one. I don't think it was necessary connection. I don't think he thought that we could know about that on the basis
of... Yeah, I did, and he spelled connection with an X. C-O-N-E-X.
But the next analysis was a counterfactual one. He said like some kind of transition word. In other words, if the cause had not happened, then the effect would not have happened.
Everything in the universe is determined by laws in this way, then so is every event that happens in your brain. Right? So that's on the one hand, that's what's called determinism. But on the other hand is this undeniably strong intuition that we are truly free, that multiple courses of action are available to us at any time.
See that? It's intuition versus science. That's all he's saying.
And that
we might have a bone to pick with the framing itself. I mean, we would have a bone to pick with the way the whole issue is being framed.
And then, so you notice the way he distinguished these two? So it's intuition versus science. Science lets us know about, I guess, the most fundamental ontological structure of the world, right? If science is the privileged discourse here. But then on the other hand, we have this intuition that we have free will. On the one hand, you got ontology. On the other hand, you have epistemology. Intuition is just epistemic. That's it. It's not rooted in any kind of like metaphysics of the agent. Agent causation doesn't come up at all. It's just kind of this floating intuition or something like that.
Yeah.
And this is what happens when you don't privilege metaphysics. When you don't make metaphysics a privileged discourse. Metaphysics is just going to be a branch of science. And so science is going to be what tells you the way the world is. And I guess
we could probably make a whole video series. You could on scientism. Weak scientism, strong scientism.
Yeah, I did a little bit of videos on it, but nothing really like in detail.
But that would be a whole nother topic for a whole nother video. That's beyond the scope of this video.
It's beyond the scope. And it permeates everywhere. It's everywhere. It stinks to high heaven.
It stinks of scientism.
That is, if we rewound the universe, I could have worn a different color shirt or made a video about a different topic. The fact that I'm doing this right now and wearing this shirt was not determined by the laws of the universe. Right now, even the most fervent determinist can't deny the strength of the feeling that free will exists, that our actions aren't determined by the universe in this way.
See, okay, so if he's going to talk about feelings too, on top of intuitions, that's totally cool. Okay, so he's mentioned two things. So a feeling, which is just, what is it, a conative state? And then you have a intuition, which is, it's not an affect, it's cognitive.
So
independent of whether or not intuitions are the way to go. We're going to get to Kaplan later. Okay.
There's something that's floating in the background here that's already present, and that's going to sort of permeate everything. It's going to sort of be lurking in the background throughout the entire video. I think that there's an implicit assumption that some kind of physicalism about the human person obtained. I don't think like a substance dualist view is really even on the table here, so here's an example of how that might make a big difference, right? Because determinism could be locally true of the universe, of the physical universe, but causal closure could be false, such that causal inputs, not themselves subject to some sort of deterministic law, can break into the universe that is locally deterministic. And at every point down the chain after which the break-in occurs, those links might be deterministic. There will have been new causal chains kicked off. Maybe we're immaterial beings. Perhaps substance dualism is true.
Oh, okay.
And so we have agent causal powers. And in the physical universe, perhaps it is locally deterministic.
Okay, right.
But causal closure is false. And so
right. Yep. I got you.
That's a view. That might be. So that's just another reason to think like he's sort of, I mean, I know like we got to give him the benefit of the doubt. He's making a 20-minute video. It's for a big YouTube audience. People that lack expertise. You got to just cut your losses sometimes. You got to say what you mean by determinism, because it can mean lots of different things.
Mm-hmm. He's given us kind of a loose definition. It's like determinism is the position that one is implied by the scientific picture of the world, and two is such that if you were to rewind the tape, everything that has happened will happen again, or must happen again, has to happen again, or what. So a lot of this stuff needs to be nailed down conceptually.
Those two conditions are consistent with views that would allow for free will, even in the strong sense.
Yep, I agree. Especially, they got to get rid of the word will. They have to say must, and they got to cash out must. They have to unpack must. Too. Yeah.
But by our own volition instead. It's a very difficult intuition to let go of. So this clash between determinism and free will leads to the problem. How do we square these? Well, some do so simply by denying either determinism or free will. Okay, so some people deny that determinism is true and say that human action is free, perhaps through some method of causation that we don't fully understand.
Okay. Let's do it.
Agent.
I wonder what method of causation he's talking about and why he's saying we don't understand it. So I agree that it's going to be in principle impossible for you to understand exactly how this causation is operating, or what this kind of causation means, if you're going to look at it through the parameters of the hard sciences. The hard sciences aren't going to understand it. This is where metaphilosophy comes in. You have to say, look.
Well, what does Chisholm say? What does Chisholm say about philosophy more generally? Chisholm is an old agent causationist. What I would say, agent causation is kind of mysterious, but causation is kind of mysterious.
Oh, right. And Van den Wagen actually says this in the article we'll talk about too. It's like, what mysteries are you willing to settle with?
Causation, the kind of billiard ball causation that we seem to think, that we think without thinking too deep about it, without thinking too hard about it, we seem to understand. Once we actually begin to do some philosophy and really look at what's going on there, it turns out that we, in fact, don't perhaps understand so well what is going on there. Causation remains mysterious. Event causation is just as mysterious as agent event causation, arguably.
Yeah, because both invoke this mysterious thing called causation. I mean, there's no consensus about what causation is, and there's no consensus about whether or not that causation should be eradicated. So like the Don Ross and James Ladyman folks, they want to eradicate causation. They think they endorse something called ontic structural realism. So at the very bottom of reality, there is no cause and effect at all. Causation might be this folk concept that you have to eradicate, but you have to like unpack exactly what the concept is that you want to label folk. So that might be a mystery too. There's no consensus on it.
Including myself, do the opposite, affirming determinism and denying that free will exists. Now, strictly speaking, I'm not a determinist because I think that some things in the universe might be random, but random events are also out of my control by definition,
Right.
so I would still deny that free will exists. But there is one other brave and, in my view, entirely misguided group called the Compatibilists. The name suggests the Compatibilist believes that free will exists and that determinism is true. And
that is actually, I mean, I don't want to be too nitpicky here, but this is important. The Compatibilist believes that free will is compatible with determinism. The compatibilist doesn't have to affirm that determinism is true. Not all compatibilists are determinists.
Right. So like what I said to you in the message, I could be like, yes, I am a compatibilist, but that doesn't mean I think compatibilism is true in this world. It could be true in another world. And it just happens to be the case that incompatibilism is true in this world.
Or if determinism were true, then I could still be free. And lots of people are compatibilists but aren't determinists because of quantum physics. Just because they take an indeterministic interpretation of they endorse an indeterministic interpretation of quantum physics. They believe that determinism is compatible with free will. They just don't believe that a determinism
is in this world. So it's the same kind of point I was making.
Yeah.
It's just
I'm just trying to be a little more
colloquial. These are key distinctions. The theses have to be world indexed. I mean, for us to be robust with these concepts right now.
Compatibilism has a long and rich history with advocates including Thomas Hobbes and David Hume, and more recently Daniel Dennett, whose fiery debate with Sam Harris.
So no mention of John Martin Fisher. He is the premier defender of compatibilism right now. Sorry.
There are much older compatibilists there are ancient compatibilists.
Right. And compatibilists have come a long way since the 17th, 18th, and even 19th centuries.
On the subject may be familiar to you. And in the face of this pantheon of respected compatibilist philosophers and detailed arguments, now stand I, the third-year philosophy undergraduate with a YouTube channel who thinks he can debunk it all. In my defense, I will be relying on the arguments of actual professional philosophers. So let's...
I appreciate that he's going to rely on the arguments of professional philosopher, right? Because he only really uses that bandwagon paper. What if professional philosophers used the word debunked? Can you imagine?
That is a rhetorically charged word that should only be used in YouTube titles.
Start with one of the earliest compatibilists, Thomas Hobbes, who in
no.
Is he one of the earliest?
They're ancient compatibilists. We're being nitpicky.
No, it's okay. What's one? Because I actually haven't. Do you know off the top of your head?
Democritus. Democritus was a proto-semi-compatibilist. Okay, so Democritus is just one example. I'm going to count him as a compatibilist. I know there are compatibilists proper, ancient compatibilists proper, but I'm just not going to pull them up right now because there's no need to. It's beyond the scope.
Liberty or freedom signifieth properly the absence of opposition. By opposition, I mean external impediments of motion.
Okay, this is freedom of action. So, folks in the audience, there is a distinction in the literature between freedom of action and freedom of the will. Please, you got to get this in here. Now, what compatibilists have done is they've kind of, and Alex is gonna agree with this. They do kind of play a word game a little bit, but liberty or freedom signifieth properly the absence of opposition. So this is, you're trapped in a jail cell. You can't leave. You can still will to leave. That's what we're talking about when we talk about free will. We're not talking about your ability to leave the cell. We're talking about your freedom of the will. The will. You can will to leave the cell even though you're trapped in the cell. By opposition, I mean external impediments of motion. right? So if you're tackling me, that's action. It's
Yeah.
not the will. So this is what compatibilists do. They talk about action instead of the will.
If you're chained to the bedpost with fluffy pink handcuffs, that's an external impediment.
Correct. So I just want to clear that up. Freedom of the will versus freedom of action. Please keep that in mind.
That is to say, so long as whatever you want to do is not impeded by some external constraint, you are free. That's it. So if you will to drive your car and do so, you acted freely, so long as whatever caused you to do so is internally determined and not subject to either compulsion or constraint by any external factors.
Right. So this is why I don't understand compatibilism. You are being coerced. Yeah, there's an absence of external constraint, but you are being coerced by internal constraint.
Right. So let me
desire states, by the wants, all that stuff.
Let me try to defend the compatibilist here a little bit.
Dare you?
Yes. You couldn't have acted otherwise. You couldn't have wanted to do otherwise. He's still endorsing that really naive theory of event causal theory of action. Yeah. Where like you have this grand desire at any one time T, and that sort of determines your action. It's going to be more nuanced than that, but let's just roll with it. They're going to agree that you couldn't have wanted to do otherwise, or that you couldn't have done otherwise, and that yes, this was in a sense foisted upon you by the past and the laws of nature. However, there's a conceptual distinction between something that is produced by an integrated system, an integrated agential system, right? So these extremely long causal arrows become integrated into your agential psyche, into the system that constitutes you as an agent. And once they become sufficiently integrated within the agential schema, right, then the effects that they produce, as actions, those are conceptually distinct from, in a really strong sense, those are conceptually distinct from external impediments or
undeniably
that are foisted onto you from the outside, right? So there's this really strong agential integration present, and that's worth something. The compatibilists might say,
no, not at all. Like none of this moves me at all, and I know it doesn't move you either. So as I already said, whether it be external or internal, there is coercion going on. And I don't care about integration. I don't care about psychological integration. I care about something independent of me, a belief, desire, state, integrated with this causal arrow or not. That is causally sufficient for my act. There is no agent. The agent is supposed to be something that's over and above the causal chains that are running through you. Like you can interact with these causal chains. You can manipulate them. You can do it on the basis of and all this stuff. But if compatibilism is true, this causal chain is running through the person.
Yeah. So I like the metaphor or the analogy of a windsock. It's like a windsock.
Right.
Or one of those wacky wailing inflatable arm tube mans. You just have this deterministic wind blowing through you, and it's integrated because it's inside the confines of the windsock, right? And it's blowing through the windsock, and it's not escaping out the sides of the windsock just yet. It's integrated, but it's still a windsock.
There's something really special though about being endowed with a brain and central nervous system that the sock does not have, that they're going to put emphasis on. And we're going to say, look, okay, that's great. The nervous system and the brain are awesome. But structurally, the same thing is going on between the brain, central nervous system and the sock.
I can imagine an immensely complex windsock. Well, I can't imagine it. Like, I can't actually image it, but I feel like I know what it would mean to talk about. We could conceive of a machine enormously complex that is like wind powered, right?
Yeah.
Such that like when the wind blows it into certain configurations, it, produces sounds that sound like a voice expressing desires, and when the wind blows other ways, a belief, something that looks like a belief state is instantiated. When the wind blows another way, there's a sort of an electrical impulse that makes some part of the machine move toward some sustenance. Just keep going and going, and you'll get a complex enough windsock, but it's still a windsock.
Yeah, it'd be functionally identical to the brain, like the parts or something. We could make a 1-for-1 kind of correspondence between whatever complexity our brain and central nervous system has to this functionally identical, extremely complicated windsock. And the same exact kind of complaint that we would apply to us mirrors what's going on with this windsock. We're not going to say the windsock has free will.
Thus, says Hobbes, a free man is he that in those things which by his strength and wit he is able to do, is not hindered to do what he has a will to. So free...
Hindered, this is all freedom of action, irrelevant. I want to know about the freedom of the will.
Yeah.
Will, according to this compatibilist, can be defined simply as the ability to do what you want to do. This seems plausible at first, right? If you can do whatever you want, you're a free being. But there's a problem with this. And the problem I'm thinking of was highlighted well by the pessimist philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer. Yeah, sure, you can do whatever you will, but you can't will what you will.
Why not? Like, seriously.
So we talked about this all. I mean, he's still endorsing this naive event causal theory of action that he did in the old video, even though I think he's gotten more sophisticated. He's gotten better since then. He's still got this naive event causal theory of action.
Right. I mean, imagine that you wanted to save money, and so you put some funds into a bank account. According to Hobbes, so long as nothing external to you was compelling you or restricting you, you acted totally freely in depositing the money. But did you choose to want to save that money? Could you, if you so please, choose to want to waste the money instead? And that's not the same thing as simply choosing to waste it.
Watch the old video.
To want to waste it?
Could you choose to want to waste it? Yes, you can. You can exercise a higher order want to inflate another want that you didn't have at a previous time. You can totally do this.
But you would only do that. You would only do that because you wanted the second order desire was stronger. That's the only reason you wanted to do that.
I want to smoke marijuana, but I also want to not want to smoke marijuana. Guess what I'm going to do to not want to smoke marijuana anymore? I'm going to go get help somewhere, and they're going to put me through a program or whatever. And guess what? I'm not going to want to smoke marijuana anymore. So
that's what you wanted more.
To want certain things. I mean, it's just what Zach? Say it again.
You know what he would say. Just like, well, that's your desire to not smoke marijuana was the stronger of the desires, and it won out, and that was the one that ended up being efficacious.
Well, my desire to smoke marijuana was the strongest desire in a particular domain.
You would just have to say that it netted out such that the desire that actually in fact moved you, the desire that in fact moved your will and preceded your action, after a net falling out, turned out to be the strongest.
I certainly can't choose to want to waste my own money. And even if you could choose to want it,
you can.
Crucially, in order to do so, you would need to want to do it.
So?
And if you could control that want, you'd need to want it, and so on forever. Schopenhauer's...
This is a virtuous regress. That's totally fine, especially with the way that libertarians reanalyze the wants.
Point is that the ability to do whatever you want can hardly be called freedom if you can't freely choose what it is that you want. And Schopenhauer illustrates this with an example. He says that as well as the material external constraints and impediments that Hobbes mentions, sometimes our actions are restricted by what Schopenhauer calls moral constraints. And he gives the example of a threat. Say someone threatens you with assault, saying that if you commit action X, they'll beat you up, and that this compels you to not commit action X. Did you make this choice freely? I think most people would say no.
Yeah, free, voluntary, willingly. There's lots of different conceptions just teetering on the edge here that he's not going to touch on that are irrelevant. right? So like, yeah, if you do something under the compulsion of threat, you're still doing it voluntarily. It's not the same as if you're being, your arm is being grabbed and you're being literally pulled along. And there are things to say about those distinctions that could be said here.
Yeah, these are gradations in freedom of action, as far as I'm concerned. This has nothing to do with the freedom of the will at all.
And perhaps Thomas Hobbes, who would probably see someone threatening you as an external constraint upon your will, making it not a free decision. But what is a threat? Right? If I say to you that if you commit action X, I'll beat you up, you still could commit action X, and I would beat you up. Right? The reason the threat is successful is simply because you don't want to be beaten up, or at least because you want to be beaten up less than you want to commit action X. But did you choose this?
What is the compatibilist understanding of control?
Yeah, so here's just a really cheap conception of control that I think is clearly control in some sense. And this is one that Frankfurt talked about, and maybe this is going to come up later. I think it will when he starts harping on control a lot. But a spider crawling up the wall, it's got control. The spider has control over the movements of its legs. No one, libertarian, compatibilist, or otherwise, right, tends to think that a spider has free will. But the spider certainly exercises control over the movements of its legs. Not control in this sort of really strong sense that Alex has in mind, which I agree is something like the sense of control that we need to ground real moral responsibility. But there are definitely weaker conceptions of control that apply and that need to be fleshed out.
To say that you can do whatever you want is to say you can do anything so long as it's this specific thing over which you have no control in determining. Some freedom. So this is one reason why I think that the distinction between internal and external constraints is a silly one.
I totally agree. That distinction is silly. Thank you, CosmicSkeptic. I totally agree with that.
Remember, compatibilism relies on this distinction, recognizing that all of our thoughts and all of our actions are determined. And my response has been to say that we have as much control over our internal constraints as we do external constraints. That is, we have no control over either of them. And so there's no meaningful reason for the compatibilist to make this distinction.
Even if compatibilism is true, if determinism is true, it's obvious that we still control things. Even if determinism is true, I still control my vehicle when I drive down the road. I control it better than some other people. Everyone thinks that they are the best controllers of a vehicle on the road, right? Even if determinism is true, I still control the movements of my spoon as I dip it into the honeycombs and bring it up to the top.
No, you don't. You don't control anything.
We aren't free whether the cause of our actions is internal or external. And so this is why the compatibilist doesn't so much defend free will as simply redefine free will. To them, free...
Yes. Now, here's the thing. Now, real quick. So it's kind of unfair to just say that what they're doing is merely redefining something. They think that they've landed on the actual concept of free will and that we got some kind of like weird thing going on. But I think where CosmicSkeptic is coming from is he's actually saying we have the correct definition of free will. And the compatibilist is kind of coming along like a snake oil salesman saying, actually, what freedom is this thing right here. And it goes perfectly in this determinism thing. I don't think he's exactly saying that, but the compatibilist is basically saying there are a set of conditions that need to be satisfied for you to have free will. Yeah. That's what they're doing. And libertarianism does not satisfy those conditions, so it's not truly free will. Your actions become arbitrary on your view, Zach. That's what they're saying. That's their argument.
Yeah, they do come along and they do say something like, well, look, the thing that you think is free will actually isn't. That thing that you're saying is free will, it's way too
random.
I mean, you're just asking way too much. It's almost magical, right? Like you're just asking. The cost is just way too steep. The requirement is just way too high. You're asking way too much. It can't be the case that if we're free, that's what it means to be free.
Yes.
Here's this much more conservative, less radical, and more reasonable view of free will. we should accept it because it is more reasonable and it's not as radical. It doesn't require this extremely high conception of control whereby we are the first movers. It's more realistic. It's what we've got, and that's one way of looking at it.
Free will is not about actual control over our actions. It's simply about whatever determines our actions being internal to ourselves. That is, we commit an action freely if it is a result of internal determination, even if we have absolutely no control over that internal cause or over the action itself. Compatibilism simply states that free will has nothing to do with the ability to ultimately control your actions. Instead, free will is about committing actions over which you may have no control, but the cause of which comes from somewhere inside you.
Okay. I'm going to rehash a point that I made earlier. Again, just playing devil's advocate for the compatibilist. I'm not a compatibilist. I think it's false. You can control what you want, even on a compatibilist picture, right? Because it could be the case that you, like you want to lose weight, or you want to stop eating so much sweets. You want to desire to eat cake less. And so you wean yourself off the sugar, right? So that kind of picture could be true on a compatibilist picture of the world. And there is a sense in which you did exercise some measure of control over what your desires ended up being after you completed the diet. And they came about all sort of within this integrated agential system. Really cleanly integrated, like there's a nice causal story that goes right through the agent really nicely. We've got this beautiful integration of the causal items that produce the eventual desires and actions. Just right there inside the windsock.
Are there any compatibilists that do not endorse the causal theory of action? They have to, correct?
I suppose you could be a non-causalist. There's logical space, at least, for someone to be a non-causalist about action or an agent causalist, but still think that even if determinism were true, that's still sufficient for free will. It would be a really strange view.
That is really odd. That would be a kind of compatibilism, though.
But for the sake of argument, let me simply grant that there is some relevant difference between internally and externally determined actions, for whatever reason. Let me simply grant that free will is just the ability to act in accordance with internal causes and without external constraint. Okay, even
sufficiently integrated.
Right.
Internal causes that are sufficiently integrated in the agential system.
Yeah, we're
not just any internal causes. Right? If you were to develop a brain lesion that caused you to do stuff, like that caused you to have like nervous tics or something, that wouldn't be arguably sufficiently integrated within the agential system to still count as the actions produced from it. Probably wouldn't count as free on the compatibilist because it's like a tumor. It's like something that's not.
Yeah, that's what I just talked about, causal deviance.
Yeah. Or if an evil scientist planted a microchip deep in the center of your brain, right?
Yep.
That wouldn't be integrated in the system in the right way for the actions it produces to count as free for the compatibilist.
Yep.
So it's not just internal, external. There's this really strong sense of agential integration that I think most compatibilists want.
Well, I mean, that internal, external distinction is still relevant. It's just we got to just focus on the internal one and just say, with regard to the internal one only, that's what we're talking about. Everything's got to be properly functioning. There's got to be no malfunction anywhere.
Yeah.
There's got to be no foreign objects inserted into the functioning to do the bidding of another agent or anything like that. It's got to be like left alone and in pristine shape. Or
integrated.
Yeah,
you got to have these clean causal lines that run throughout the agent's sort of internal lifetime.
I think compatibilism fails, and let me tell you why. Remember, compatibilism assumes that determinism is true, right? It's an affirmation of the compatibility between determinism and free will.
No. Compatibilists think that free will and determinism are compatible, but they don't have to be determinists. And in fact, a great many of them are not determinists. Even the ones that are compatibilists in this world may believe of this world that determinism is false. Well, I think there may in fact be just as many or more compatibilists that in fact are not.
I think that's true too.
Determinists.
I think that's true too.
If determinism is true, then everything that happens in the universe is the result of some previous chain of causation dating back to the beginning of time.
Okay.
Right?
Okay. Recall the view that I mentioned earlier, where you can have determinism that applies locally to the entire physical universe, but where causal closure is not the case, right? So that is still a sort of determinism, but perhaps agents, causal factors external to this system that is not causally closed, themselves perhaps not subject to deterministic laws, can break in to the locally deterministic system. So immaterial agent causation, right? If I'm a soul perhaps, or if I'm a mind, an immaterial mind, I can have a causal influence on the physical universe. I can insert the beginnings of a new causal chain. And my agent causing was not causally preceded by any causally sufficient item or causally necessitated by any prior causal item. But everything that happens subsequent down the chain, once it's already in the sort of deterministic bubble of the physical universe, all those links can be deterministic. And I'm fine with that. Isn't the view I'm expressing, wouldn't this be Craig's view? Doesn't Craig endorse a deterministic interpretation of quantum mechanics?
I don't think he takes a position. I think he just says the Bohmian interpretation is open.
But he says it in the context of
possible.
Yeah, well, he says it in the context, of the Kalam, where people try to bring indeterminism as a charge against one of the premises or something. I'm a little hazy.
Premise, yeah.
And so then he says, well, no, look, a deterministic interpretation of quantum mechanics might be true. But if that were the case, it seems like determinism would obtain, at least in the physical universe.
Mm-hmm. On the micro level.
But he's also a libertarian. He's also a libertarian about free will and a substance dualist. So I would assume that he takes the view that I just described.
I think any dualist would.
Well, you might be a substance dualist, but not be a determinist about the physical universe.
Oh, you're saying, okay, right. Be like a Copenhagen guy about the quantum crap and be a dualist.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm saying if you think that the physical stuff is determined.
The moral of the story for me is that I would be totally fine with determinism localized to the physical universe, as long as we deny causal closure and I am an immaterial simple.
Yes. I totally agree with that. That's a good
can causally break in.
So now let's consider the supposed difference between an external cause of action and an internal cause of action, that distinction which compatibilism relies upon. So the compatibilist thinks that if a boulder were to roll over and knock me off a cliff, I didn't freely choose to fall off that cliff because the cause of my doing so was external to me. But if I jump off that cliff, then I did act freely because the cause of me falling off the cliff was internal to me. Okay, well now consider the following. Let's say that I'm just walking along a road and a boulder rolls out in front of me, and not wanting to be crushed by it, I jump out of the way. According to the compatibilist, did I freely choose to jump? Well, kind of. The chain of causation that ultimately determined your action will always stretch back to something external, just like the chain of causation when I jumped from the boulder stretches back ultimately to...
I agree with this, and I think he's giving sort of a simplistic version of an argument that has sort of a more sophisticated expression in some of the literature. Galen Strawson gives something like a more sophisticated version of this argument that he's giving here. But the form of this argument that he's giving right now, the general mood, the aim of it, is something that I vibe with deeply, and I agree.
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, if determinism is true, everything's linked together causally.
Well, even if indeterminism is true, and the causal links are probabilistic, it's still linked together in such a way that your higher sense of control is eradicated.
Because you can have causal links either way, deterministically or indeterministically.
Indeed.
Indeed, that is a good distinction to keep in mind.
As a free action. Of course, you can always simply deny the idea that our actions are all determined in this way. But then you're just not a compatibilist, because compatibilism assumes that determinism is true. All I'm trying to show is that if you do think determinism is true, as the compatibilist does, then you've kissed goodbye to free will. And even the vaguely redefined form of free will that compatibilists hold to.
I mean, if they truly are latching onto a different understanding of free will, then he has no right to say that. He's just, the compatibilist means something different by free will. It's the kind of free will you have once you make it compatible with determinism.
He's done nothing to dispatch their view, actually. I mean, what you have to do is argue that that conception of freedom is just way too weak sauce to get us the kinds of things we want got by our conception of free will, like moral responsibility.
Right.
But you're not going to be able to show that, like, that thing that they're saying is free will isn't free will, because that's just their view.
Right. He's kind of starting out like, we've got the correct understanding of free will. So theirs is just a rewording.
And let me demonstrate this problem a bit further by using the terminology of the philosopher Peter van Inwagen, who in his essay, The Powers of Rational Beings, Freedom of the Will, defines two types of facts. The first he describes as such: there are certain facts that no human being can do anything about, and that no human being in history could ever have done anything about. Among these are the fact that the Earth is round, the fact that magnets attract iron, the fact that there were once dinosaurs, and the fact that 317 is a prime number. Even those who believe in free will obviously accept that some such facts exist, right? Facts over which we have absolutely no control, since there's absolutely nothing we can do to affect their truth. Now, to believe in free will, there are some facts that aren't untouchable, right? Things like deciding to drive your car. And we might call any fact that you do get to control a touchable fact. So if free will exists, there are some touchable facts. Free will is just the existence of at least some touchable facts. So here's the problem. Van Inwagen introduces a logical principle which goes as follows. If P is an untouchable fact, and Q follows from P, then Q is also an untouchable fact. That is to say, if there is some state of affairs...
Okay, do you remember from the essay whether or not Van Inwagen goes into what he means by follows? Like, is he talking about being closed under entailment?
Yeah, it's I mean, the property gets transferred to the consequent. If Q follows from P,
right,
and P is untouchable, then the untouchability is transferred to Q. It's transitive. If P then Q, if Q then R, and if P is untouchable, then it's going to be transitive, and it's going to move all the way through to R. And I think that's right.
Oh yeah, it's definitely right. If that arrow is an arrow of entailment.
And if it's also true that if P then Q, then since the cause of Q is untouchable, Q is itself untouchable. You didn't cause it, you couldn't stop it, untouchable. For example, let's say that P is the state of the universe 5 billion years ago. Clearly an untouchable fact. And let's say that Q is the formation of the Earth. If the formation of the Earth follows necessarily from the state of the universe 5 billion years ago, then since the first fact is untouchable, so is the second. Correct. Now, determinism is simply the belief that for every state of affairs Q, there is some preceding state of affairs P, which brought about Q by causal necessity. So the fact that I'm currently saying these words was brought about by some previous cause, itself brought about by some previous cause, and so on until we get to, say...
an unmoved mover, which is the agent himself.
Go on, because I have to stay here.
The state of the universe 5 billion years ago. Right? And using Van Inwagen's principle, we can see that every single step along the chain of causation...
Oh, by the way, you know what Dirk Beherboom says in Living Without Free Will? No. The only view that could possibly save you
is agent causation.
That's what he says.
Metaphysically impossible, according to people like Beherboom.
I think he thinks it's metaphysically possible.
Well, I definitely know he's not a agent causation.
Oh, no, not at all.
From the state of the universe 5 billion years ago, all the way up until now, is an untouchable fact.
Okay. But now, what is the compatibilist going to say? They're going to point to one of the links. For instance, let's take a look at the link between R and P. right? That red arrow between R and P. If R represents like the events and states that were in play sort of prior to the agent's existence, and now P are the events and states that are sort of in play once the agent has been going on for a while and has existed for a while, then the requisite control, the necessary control that the compatibilist wants for free will is going to have worked itself in somewhere in the red arrow there between R and P, because at some point the relevant causal items will have become integrated in the right way in the agential system. Right? So control can work its way in on the compatibilist picture via this agential integration. The causal items become integrated in the system. There's no sort of malfunction going on, just like we talked about earlier. So that's what the compatibilist is going to say. So now look, we have this image here of these arrows going across. Suppose we accept that that's what a deterministic picture would look like. But now imagine some causal item, call it A, up above and beyond this little chain, this little deterministic chain he has here, right? And A has a causal arrow running down from above, breaking into the causal chain. And A has no prior causal, no items preceding it causally, and it is outside the causal conflux, the causal confines of the system in which this deterministic chain that he's got here is operating. That's sort of the view that I would want to take, an agent causal view, where we deny the causal closure of the physical universe, and I think I want to take some substance dualism as well.
So if a belief in free will is just the belief that there exist some touchable facts, then free will doesn't exist unless determinism is false. Because if determinism is true, then all facts...
The determinism has to be necessarily false.
If a determinism that infects all of reality obtained, yes, he's right. But if it's a determinism that only applies to a non-causally closed domain,
right,
like
yeah.
the physical universe, then no, he's not necessarily right about this.
Now, interestingly, Van Inwagen actually concludes that free will does exist, but he does so on the basis that his intuition of free will is just so strong that it must be accurate, even though he has no idea how it would work, and he admits as such.
Is that correct?
It's not just like, oh, I have this really strong intuition of free will, and so I'm going to believe it. It's not just that. Yes, that's part of it. But like, we have these notions of moral responsibility. Van Inwagen's got this classical theism going on in the background. There is this mystery trade-off going on that he talks about. So it's really not quite as simple as just, I feel it, so I'm going to believe it, even though no good case can be made. It's not that simple.
How do I sound?
That's a lot better.
Okay, that's the snowball speaker. That's the snowball mic. Oh, yeah, so the Van Inwagen thing. It isn't, you're right, it isn't quite so simple as just, well, I have this intuition that free will, of free will, and so free will must be true, even though I can't think of it a good account. In the background, it's not just as simple as that, because he's got this sort of mystery trade-off thing going on that he mentions. And then in the background, he's got these assumptions of sort of classical theism permeating his worldview. And then there's also the moral intuitions, right? There's moral responsibility, the really strong sense that moral responsibility requires free will. So there's a lot more to it than what Alex is making it to seem just here.
So if God were to come up to Van Inwagen and be like, hey, determinism's true, he'd just come to the conclusion that he doesn't understand reality at all, or something like that.
Essentially makes a really great case against free will, and then just throws his hands up to the sky and goes, well, free will has to exist, though, so it's all a grand mystery.
That is an extremely uncharitable representation of Van Inwagen's article at the end.
There is no position one can take concerning free will that does not confront its adherence with mystery.
Right, yeah, this is thing.
There's mystery on all sides, no matter which view you take. That's what he's saying.
But yeah, independent of what's true or false, this is what Van Inwagen is arguing. That representation that CosmicSkeptic just gave of the essay is not correct. The argument's a little more subtle than that. It's saying, pick your view on the free will problem. Each one will lead to mysteries, and you have to kind of adjudicate which mystery you want to kind of be stuck with. And according to his own experience, according to his background beliefs, all the stuff that you had brought up before, he thinks that the mystery that has the least costs, I guess, to his claim to understand reality is going to be this mystery of free will, because he just has a direct acquaintance with the phenomenology of moral responsibility, blameworthiness, praiseworthiness, free will, all this stuff.
Choosing among alternatives. He's got the background theism going on. You've got a perfectly good and powerful and knowing God that holds people accountable for actions, so on and so forth.
These are the mysteries that confront the adherents of the various positions one might take concerning free will. These mysteries exist. There you go. The metaphysician's task is to display these mysteries. Each of us must decide, with no further help from the metaphysician, how to respond to the array of mysteries that the metaphysician has placed before us. That's the end of the article. He goes into this. He goes into what he does in his own mind when he wrestles with the different positions that are out there and the mysteries that are entailed by these different positions that you can take.
Yeah.
And
he says that someone who believes that human beings don't have free will, in fact, accepts an even bigger mystery than the one he does. Right there. I accept this mystery because it seems to me the smallest mystery available. If someone believes that human beings do not have free will, that person accepts a mystery, and in my view, a greater, deeper mystery than the one I accept.
A disappointing ending to the otherwise brilliant essay, which you can read in full by clicking the link in the description.
Yeah, and we did. We found out that you misrepresented the essay. Thank you. Appreciate the link.
Sorry about my bad mic quality. It's going to be awesome.
You're fired. You're fired.
It's going to be awesome from now on, just as good as it is right now, because I've got...
Yes, it sounds great right now.
Got my beginner mic right here.
Thank you so much for coming by, guys. You guys are awesome. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and look in the video description for all the different kind of social media stuff we got going on. We're churning out videos faster and faster. Thanks for tuning in. Love you guys. Stay safe.